Thank you very much for joining today. From now, hosted by Sasakawa Foundation, we would like to start SPF China Observer Public Forum. Thank you very much for viewing SPF China Observer Public Forum. Today's title is Observation on Lack of Transparency in China's Nuclear Arms Expansion. I apologize for the delay in starting. Research fellow Mr. Yuki Kobayashi has published the paper, and we will be basing on that. And Mr. Kobayashi is working on disarmament and the civilian use of nuclear power at the foundation. But when we speak about Japan, we are just trying to separate the two for military and civilian use. But in English, it's nuclear. For Ukraine aggression, there was intimidation of a nuclear, and also there is attack to the Zaporizhzhia power station, and it is not possible to detach this nuclear issue from security. In July, NPT review conference was held, and there a nuclear disarmament negotiation should be done faithfully, and there were discussions amongst the nations at that conference. But looking at the Ukraine station, use of nuclear weapons and also for nuclear deterrence, there are discussions. But when it comes to the arms control of nuclear weapons and also for nuclear disarmament, what are the impacts? Those are the areas we need to study as well. We will be focusing on the nuclear expansion in China, and in China there are rapidly increasing the number of nuclear warheads. In the United States, the Department of Defense has been publishing the military report of China every year, and in the 2021 version, China currently has 350 warheads, and by the end of 2030, they are trying to increase to 1,000. And how they are going to increase this is critical at the moment. For civilian use, the plutonium used for power plants, we are suspecting that there is a secret, they are secretly converting for military use. In today's discussion, research fellow Mr. Kobayashi is going to explain based on data, and after explaining from a quantitative perspective, he will also talk about how Japan will respond. Over to you.
Thank you very much. I'm a researcher at National Security Research Group of Sasakawa Peace Foundation. My name is Kobayashi. I do research onto nuclear non-proliferation and civilian use of nuclear power. And today we would like, together with you, to think about China's nuclear strategy and nuclear armament. NPT review conference was just held in New York the other day. With Russia's objection, a final agreement was not adopted, and progress on nuclear disarmament had to be stalled. And on top of these trends that we see these days, what is concerning to Asia, in particular Japan, is that the proposal for putting a stop to the production of nuclear fissile material, including plutonium, which is expected to have impact on preventing nuclear armament from expanding any further, was met with a very strong objection coming from China. And this is related to what I'm about to talk about today as a theme. And U.S. DOD is projecting that the number of China's nuclear stockpile is going to reach 1,000 by 2030. And the reason for this projection is that they are trying to convert civilian use plutonium for military purpose. And therefore, this is related to why China launched a strong objection at NPT review conference. Well, as a matter of fact, China used to report plutonium holdings to IAEA, but it stopped doing so in 2017. And during the same period, it started construction of 2 nuclear fuel reprocessing facilities to extract plutonium from spent fuel from nuclear power plants, according to satellite imagery. Lack of transparency in plutonium production and nuclear arms expansion not only heightens tension between the U.S. and China in the Asian region, but it may also even lead to collapse of global nuclear order built around the NPT. Next page, please. So based on this awareness, I would like to provide an outlook of China's plutonium production capability in the future and analyze how it is linked to projected increase of China's nuclear warhead stockpile, and I would like to analyze the changes in China's nuclear strategy and provide a segue to the panel discussion to follow. Next page, please. Now, with respect to China's production of plutonium, for many years, China had produced its plutonium at a military facility in the inland province of Gansu. However, the facilities was shut down by 1987. Meanwhile, civilian use of nuclear energy started in earnest in 1980 in China. From 2010 onward, contrary to the global slowdown in the use of nuclear energy in the aftermath of Fukushima nuclear plant accident, China has built more nuclear plants to reduce the ratio of coal-fired power generation as part of its effort to deal with global warming. These consist mostly of PWR, pressurized water reactors built through technology transfer from France. As of January 2021, there are 48 nuclear plants in operation, number exceeding that in Japan, and 16 more are being constructed. However, due to economic development, demand for power is predicted to double the level in 2020 by 2040. If China is to meet the increasing demand for power with more PWRs, it will have to procure 50% of world's supply of uranium. To avoid a shortage of nuclear fuel, China is aiming to extract plutonium from spent fuel at PWRs, mixing this with uranium to fabricate MOX fuel for use at fast breeder reactors, FBRs, which generate electricity more efficiently. For this purpose, China reportedly built a new experimental plutonium reprocessing plant at a site next to previously closed a military facility, which began operations around 2010. And since 2015, construction of 2 new reprocessing plants is underway in the desert in Gansu province, in a location not far from the experimental plant. According to satellite image, it's reckoned that the first plant will start operating around 2025, the second one around 2030. The fast breeders that will use reprocessed plutonium from the above facilities are known as dream nuclear reactors, where new plutonium is produced through nuclear fuel reaction during their operation, enabling the recovery of more plutonium than the amount injected. The US, Russia, France, and the UK and Japan were the leaders in developing this technology for practical application. Japan operated the Monju prototype reactor from 1994 to 1995. However, the management of sodium to cool the reactor has been a big challenge, and so Monju, in fact, suffered a sodium leak incident. So countries with this technology ceased or froze development, but China has moved ahead with its FBR development, and 2 large FBRs called CFR 600 are expected to start operation by 2026. However, FBR development always comes with concerns about the conversion of nuclear materials for military use, because it will be easy to extract weapon-class, weapon-grade, ultra-pure plutonium-239. Next page, please. While it's difficult to extract ultra-pure plutonium-239 from the PWRs and other nuclear reactors currently used for power generation in the world, massive amounts of weapon-class plutonium, as is illustrated in the diagram specifically, can be extracted. As you can see from the diagram, uranium-238 in blue, which covers plutonium at the core of the fuel, because it wraps around plutonium like a blanket, it's referred to as blanket fuel. Uranium-238 itself cannot be fuel, but when it collides with neutrons emitted by burning plutonium in the reactor, it turns into Pu-239 and can be used as fuel. It's more efficient to use up all the plutonium created in the reactor for the purpose of power generation. If it's taken out in the middle before it's exhausted, it's strongly suspected that it may be converted for military use. For this reason, the IAEA had closely monitored the movement of fuel while Bonji was in operation from the standpoint of nuclear non-proliferation. However, China is allowed to possess nuclear weapons under NPT, so it's not required to accept IAEA inspection. If the operation of the BRs begins in earnest in China, it's highly possible that international community will no longer be able to track movement of nuclear fuel.
Then how would this arrangement of the nuclear power plants would lead to increase in plutonium production? Looking from the current data and looking at China's plutonium holdings, according to guidelines for management of plutonium of IAEA, in the last report of 2016, it's 40.9 kilograms, as you can see in red. If there is the operation of a CFR 600 two reactors according to schedule, with only that, it is possible to obtain 330 kilograms of plutonium for weapon use. Nuclear warhead would require 3.5 kilograms plus minus 0.5 per warhead. So this is equivalent to 82 to 110 warheads. The experts do take into consideration of the technical difficulty of nuclear fuel cycle and give range to what can be extracted. We are looking at the total amount of a small SPR plus fast breeder reactor plutonium annual production, and it's shown in the table, as you can see in bold letters. By adding the plutonium which is currently held, as of 2030, the estimate for weapon use of plutonium of China is expected to be 2.9 ton plus minus 0.6. Next page, please. This is equivalent to 830 nuclear warheads plus minus 210. US DOD's analysis of what I explained, there is a possibility of holding 1,000 nuclear warheads by 2030, and this conforms to the increased plutonium production in China. So this kind of plutonium increased production in China raises doubts to the United States and the neighboring countries. That is because this seems to be linked with the change in nuclear strategies of China. Next page, please. China in 1964 succeeded in nuclear test experiment, and then by maintaining the medium retaliatory capability against a nuclear attack, they have oriented the minimum deterrence policy. But since the end of the Cold War, U.S. concluded anti-ballistic missile treaty between Russia, but it was abrogated by strengthening missile defense. The premise for maintaining the minimum deterrence collapsed by China. In other words, the first attack was received with the missile, and there is a possibility that they are trying to separate the diversity of the delivery vehicles. So MIRV and supersonic missiles development, which can break through missile defense system, are now being developed. China is one of the 5 countries which is allowed to possess nuclear weapons in NPT: U.S., Russia, China, United Kingdom, and France. And they have declared unconditional non-first-use nuclear policy. And under this policy, they have been separating and storing warheads and the delivery vehicles. But recently, they are trying to expand nuclear power in transparent manner. And the international community has doubts over whether they are going to retain the nuclear policy based on NFU. Suppose China's increased plutonium production and military diversion and the change of nuclear strategy and nuclear expansions to occur in real terms. What kind of impact would that have for both military terms and nuclear non-proliferation? There could be serious impact to international community. From military front, if China recognizes that it can establish arms balance with the U.S., it would determine that it is able to deter U.S. intervention in security of Asia, and it can take aggressive action, including changing the status quo by force. There is a significant impact to a non-proliferation structure. According to NPT, they have stipulated in Article 4 that it is an inalienable right of non-nuclear weapon nations to use nuclear materials for civilian purposes. Article 3 stipulates that with a view to preventing diversion of nuclear energy from peaceful uses to nuclear weapons or other energy explosive devices, non-nuclear weapon states undertake to accept IAEA safeguards. But non-nuclear weapon powers are exempted from safeguards, so there's discontent amongst the non-nuclear weapon state that it is unfair. And if China converts plutonium for civilian use to military purposes behind IAEA's back, Iran and other nations keen on developing nuclear arms may follow suit. Please move on to the next page. How should Japan react? In the screen, you see 2019 edition of Japan's National Defense Program Guidelines. In summary, on short-term basis, Japan is taking the attitude to enhance nuclear deterrence and abolition of nuclear weapons to strengthen the credibility to deter expansion. What Japan can offer will be delegated to the expert, and I would like to hear the view of Mr. Ohara later on. But it is necessary to understand that Japan is under very tough security environment. Around Japan, there is Russia, which is deploying intermediate-range cruise missile, and there's North Korea, which is accelerating nuclear and missile development. And we also need to respond to nuclear arms expansion of China. Disarmament, non-proliferation, Japan needs to make contribution to maintain the credibility of NPT structure and continue to enhance the transparency of a multilateral framework. And we need to continue to advocate that in order to make sure not to link to civilian use of nuclear power to nuclear weapons. We need to use our knowledge and experience. Japan is the only non-nuclear weapon state which is allowed to extract the plutonium and to reuse at the FBR. Japan should continue to ask for securing the transparency of report to IAEA and also for the operation of the site producing materials such as enriched uranium, which can be converted to military purposes. And we just need to continue to raise the international credibility promoting non-proliferation of nuclear power. Japan is the one which tried to drag China to NPT. In 1989, when China was isolated due to Tiananmen incident, in order to arrange the climate to resume a yen loan, it has asked for contribution to the international community and achieved accession to NPT in 1992. Japan should try to show the path to nuclear disarmament and the strengthening of non-proliferation. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. Thank you for also discussing the role of Japan, what the role of Japan should be. We will discuss that later. And I would like to turn to Professor Takahara for comments, but before that, I will like to seek clarification to Kobayashi-san. So plutonium for civilian use to be converted into military purpose, to regulate that, to control that. One of such articles is included as part of NPT. So NPT, IAEA, confidence in that could fade if plutonium is converted for military use. Of course, it should not happen, but then what are the articles preventing that from happening? Well, there are IAEA safeguards that prevent a conversion into military use. Safeguards may be difficult to understand, but IAEA surveillance activities and inspection activities, that's what safeguards are. And under NPT, for the 5 nuclear nations that are admitted, safeguards are not a requirement. They are conducted on a voluntary basis. So these safeguards are applied to non-nuclear weapon countries who are members of NPT, so that they will not engage in nuclear development for military use. So unfortunately, China, if it is to use plutonium for civilian use, to convert that into military purpose, there's no international mechanism to stop them from doing so. Thank you very much. Okay, Professor Takahara. We just heard about a projected increase of China's nuclear stockpile, and behind that, there's a strong suspicion that they are converting civilian use of plutonium for military purpose. And there was also discussion on strategy by Kobayashi-san. But in the background of China's increasing nuclear warhead stockpile, what are China's intentions and strategies? Well, I'm actually a layperson when it comes to this topic. I have more questions and comments on this, but let me attempt to answer the question posed to me. Well, China's strategic competition with the U.S. is intensifying. I think that is in the background, and that is one of the major reasons why China is engaging in what it is engaging in. Well, China's diplomacy is becoming something like Russians. Russia always had competition with the U.S., and through Russia's competition with the U.S., they would see things, and it's a rather distorted lens, I should say. And in the second year of the Trump administration and onward, the more intense the competition with the U.S. becomes, it seems that China seems to be increasingly looking at things through this distorted lens. And so that is the impression that I have increasingly these days. So what is surprising is U.S. DOD's projection. The pace of increase in nuclear warhead stockpile is very fast. As of 2021, China is estimated to have 350 nuclear warheads, and in less than a decade, they're going to triple the number to 1,000, according to DOD's projection. So is China prepared to go that far? So the pace of increase is very fast, and that is one of the points strongly impressed upon. It strikes us. So about the pace of increase, I had a question of Mr. Kobayashi. China is making such a haste. China is rushing to increase its number of nuclear warheads. it seems. And when it comes to nuclear issues, when it comes to the issue of nuclear weaponry, we here in Japan tend to look at North Korea's nuclear development activities, and of late, Russia-Ukrainian war, Zaporizhia nuclear power plant, for example. These are very prominent events, and there were very important international conferences held on this year. And what we hear from press reports is that there's a lot of focus on Russia-Ukrainian war. That's the impression that we get from the press reports when it comes to nuclear issues. So, on that question, Mr. Kobayashi? Well, let me respond to your question then, Kobayashi speaking. So, in the circumstances surrounding nuclear issues, why are we focusing so much on Russia? In the NPT review conference, because of Russia's objection, the final agreement was not adopted. That is one reason. On the other hand, I actually went to report on NPT review conference, and one of the members there said that other nuclear nations made Russia to take the joker card so that Russia would stick out. Well, and so they sort of hid behind Russia. Some of the nuclear nations did not want something inconvenient in the agreement. And China also was against the proposal for reducing plutonium production or nuclear fissile material production. But in the background, I'm sure China is increasing its production of plutonium. And as a piece of evidence, can we have the satellite image up on the screen to show China's plutonium production site? So in the presentation, I talked about this CFR fast breeder reactor. They have 2 units of them, and the facility is under construction. And there's a white part above, and that's the control tower. This is as of January 2020. And on the right, you can see the foundation of a construction site, sort of. On the left-hand side, it's almost vacant, almost no equipment. So that's January 2 years ago. And let's take a look at another image. Can we have that up? It's black and white, monochrome, hard to see, but on the right-hand side of the image, you can see 2 new buildings propping up. On the left-hand side, CFR 2 units. Where it used to be vacant 2 years ago, you can see quite a bit of foundation being laid. And 2 white buildings on the right. Below that, so white buildings with dots on top, I think they house FBRs. They contain FBRs. And the smaller building above that, steam that comes from the reactor is used to turn the turbine. So it's a turbine facility. And together with the experts, we are conducting analysis on satellite imagery, and we will show that on SPF website in the relevant section. CFR1 is close to completion according to this image, and so FY 2023 it's going to go operational. If it goes as planned, then 100 kilogram of plutonium can be produced, and so at the pace predicted by US DOD, China will increase the number of nuclear warheads. It's not a fantasy. It is very much likely. So it's a viable projection, I should say. Thank you. So on the chat box, we are receiving comments and questions already. And so please feel free to ask questions, even whilst we're discussing. Please type in your questions in the chat box during Q&A. We will share them with the audience so that they can be answered by Kobayashi-san. As was said, looking at satellite imagery, CFR 600 is being constructed, 2 units of them. So China is looking to increase the production of plutonium, and that can be confirmed from the image of the site. An NPT review conference, at that conference, so temporary stop of plutonium production increase, China was against that. So it was not included in the document. And they're using FBRs, and most probably using civilian use plutonium, converting that into military use. So that was revealed from the image. But under NPT, safeguards do not necessarily apply to nuclear powers. They're not a requirement. So given this situation, how should Japan respond? What should be the role of Japan from a non-proliferation point of view? As researcher Mr. Kobayashi talked about this, given the circumstances, how can we stop the proliferation of nuclear weapons? It seems quite difficult, and the reason is, as Professor Takahara mentioned, China want to counter the U.S. China wants to compete with the U.S. and be on equal footing with the U.S. And the number of warheads held, according to SIPRI, 5,428 held by U.S. in 2020. In the same year, China had 350. And so I think China is concerned about the gap in the number of warheads between U.S. and China. Deterrence is about awareness, Unless your opponent thinks that they have enough warheads, there will be no deterrence. And so I think China wants to be equal with the U.S. in terms of the number of warheads, given the gap. And China's nuclear strategy are changing from minimum deterrence to MAD. Their strategy is changing. It was mentioned in the presentation. So actually, China is trying to change the operation of a continental ballistic missile. ICL silo in Mongolia, they're digging a big hole to store the missile system. And that's what China is trying to do. They're constructing a facility. Within one facility, more than 100 missiles can be made operational. And this is a site that can be confirmed by civilian use satellite image. And so it will be difficult to survive the first strike. And so they will have to change their strategy, and the U.S. has same practice, but I think this is testimony to the fact that China is fast catching up with the U.S. But for China to be equal with the U.S., it will have to increase the number of warheads.
So how should we respond to that kind of situation? That is the discussion. And given the circumstances, the safeguard in NPT it does not apply to nuclear possessing nations, but changing this provision, is it realistic? This kind of provision is only applied to non-nuclear possessing state, but if this can be applied to a nuclear possessing state, then the plutonium used for nuclear warhead, we may be able to stop the increase. But what do you think about this situation? Unfortunately, IAEA does not apply safeguard to a nuclear weapon state. And for the development of a nuclear weapon in non-nuclear weapon state, they are in the shortage of resources. So one point of argument is that we need to discuss on the efficiency of IAEA safeguard. For example, in case of Japan, Japan has been contributing and cooperating to IAEA, and to nations with a high level of technology, we should have a stringent level of inspection, and there should be a saving of the human resources, and to a nuclear weapon state, they should grasp the situation of the civilian use. And as I mentioned in my presentation, just like an international plutonium guideline, there should be obligation to provide a report, and that may become the first step for the nuclear weapon state. Thank you very much. So safeguard to be applied immediately to nuclear weapon state is difficult. Then on the other hand, is it possible to change the intention of China, the military expansion of China, in terms of the military capability? They want to be in parity with the United States. And is there any kind of impact for action to be taken to China's intention? I would like to turn to Professor Takahara. Under the current leadership, it's difficult, very bullish as a leader, very conscious about the United States, and speaking to the general public, they are now approaching closer to the center of the world. So this is the kind of a leader. So as you pointed out, the favorable change to us is hard to be achieved under the current leadership, unfortunately. Thank you very much. Then, if that is the case, diplomatic efforts or including the economic relationship, we should use all kinds of means to approach China, but it will be very difficult to get the immediate result, and it is not possible to immediately apply safeguard from IAEA. We should take a step-by-step approach to start to report on plutonium holding. So in view of the worst-case scenario, there is a need to respond to China's nuclear deterrence policy. China is trying to deter the military exercise of the United States, and it would become an issue of what China wishes to achieve. There should be communication with China, and if President Putin, just like what President Putin did to Ukraine, and if China tries to change the status quo in Asian region, Japan, together with the United States, together with the allies of the United States, we need to demonstrate that it will not be realistic in Asian region. Also, in the satellite images earlier, CFR 600 of China was shown as under construction already. So, Mr. Kobayashi, other than this facility, for the increased production of plutonium, do you also understand that there are other facilities in the desert area of Gansu province? There is a reprocessing plant of nuclear fuel, which is under construction. And if I just talk about the current status of analyzing the satellite image, we call it a stack, but I can observe two stacks. In other words, we can suspect that they are trying to construct two reprocessing plant, two stacks. And after reprocessing and try to develop fuels, they need to cut the material and try to dissolve and melt the material. And there is rare gas produced with a radioactive nature. So this has this kind of characteristic. And in other words, it's being emitted. So this means that there is a completion of the first process. I mentioned that it will be from 2025 to 2030, but we're expecting that they will start operation. In Japan, we have reprocessing plant in Wakasho village of Aomori, and the completion was delayed. That was in 1997, but they have the safety criteria, and if there is a deficiency, even in one location, I don't think they would stop the operation. So by 2030, we're expecting that there will be operation of two reprocessing plants. Thank you very much for your comment. Now, in the chat box, we received questions already, and from here and onward, we would like to move on to Q&A sessions. One is technical questions, so I would like to turn to Mr. Kobayashi. From the light water reactor, plutonium-240 can be produced from PWR. So it is not possible to develop atomic bomb, a nuclear bomb from there. And you talked about this at the beginning, but can you talk about this? Light water reactor from PWR, the extracted plutonium, as was mentioned, plutonium-240 or plutonium-238 are the materials, and the percentage of plutonium-239 is slightly above 50%. And if this is used as a fuel to be injected to FBR, then the ratio will become 93 to 94%. Very high purity plutonium-239 can be extracted. So using this and converting this from PWR to a nuclear weapon would be not impossible, but it would have a difficulty. To be more specific, plutonium-238 will have a fission and it will emit heat, and there could be damage to ignition device, and it could have some premature explosion. So the plutonium which is extracted from PWR, it is impossible in substantive terms. Thank you very much for your comment. Next is related to MPT structure. This MPT structure may be already outdated, and each state should stress more on deterrence of nuclear, focus on nuclear deterrence. This is not only limited to China, but under this structure, is it possible to promote nuclear disarmament? This is what I would like to ask Mr. Kobayashi. And another question to Professor Takahara is that how does China view this NPT in asking for for the change of the wording in the final report was mentioned, but China did not negate this kind of a scheme. But going forward, how do you think that China is trying to take advantage of a NPT structure?
Kobayashi-san first. Well, under the current NPT, not just Russia, but China, as I talked in my presentation, the 5 major nuclear powers, they are prioritizing their own national interest and security, and they always complain about the wording used in the final document. That always happens. And there are nuclear powers who are not members of NPT, who are not signatories to NPT. So nuclear order under NPT, it is being eroded. We have to admit to that fact. Following the 2015 review conference, this time the final agreement was not adopted for 2 times in a row. And in the NPT review conference that was just held, inclusive of Japan, U.S. deterrence capability is the basis of Japan. In other words, countries, including Japan, who are under the U.S. nuclear umbrella, they were also subjected to harsh criticism. So with respect to preemptive use of nuclear weapon, it was mentioned in the initial draft document, but because it was objected to by the U.S., it was deleted. But Japan and other U.S. allies, if that is not mentioned, then that could erode the confidence in extended deterrence and NPT. And so, inclusive of countries like Japan, we have not been able to successfully make NPT operational. So final agreement was not adopted. On the last day of the review conference, I had a chance to talk with one of the high-ranking officials of the Japanese government. Having said so, NPT is still important. Each country does have awareness that NPT is still important. So non-proliferation for nuclear disarmament, we need a place to discuss. And so the countries are willing to make NPT a forum to discuss that. So this may include wishful thinking, but we will just have to rely on the good faith and the goodwill of each member participating in NPT. Thank you. Takahara-san, please. So under the NPT regime, nuclear powers are obligated to make efforts toward nuclear disarmament. And therefore, what China is doing right now is against that. Well, then, does China disregard NPT, that it does not think that it's important? I don't think so. From China's perspective, the same with the UN Security Council as well as NPT, be NPT or UN Security Council, it has its privilege as a nuclear power, and that privilege is protected by NPT. And so if NPT is not functioning because of North Korea's nuclear development and other countries' nuclear development, if that continues, it poses a problem for China. So what is concerning from China's perspective is Japan's nuclearization, and NPT is there to prevent that from happening, from Japan acquiring nuclear weapons. So it seems contradictory, but China does value NPT to a certain extent. Thank you.
And moving on to the next question. Earlier, in Mr. Kobayashi's report, it was mentioned that Japan was operating FBR module. So Japan has knowledge about FBR. China is now trying to increase production of plutonium using FBR. And if that is the case, then Japan against what China is trying to use FBR. Maybe Japan is able to understand the technology. So when it comes to the use of this FBR in collaboration with the IAEA, I would suspect, but Japan may be able to have some kind of influence over China. Would it be possible? I introduced the analysis of the satellite images, but FBR, there is a fuel containing plutonium in the center, and that is surrounded by uranium-238. And the fuel in the middle will be combusted by taking about 1 year, and that will be converted to plutonium-239. So over 1.5 and 2 years, they will be combusted. So looking at the satellite images, if China is trying to replace fuels within the cycle of less than 1 year, they must be trying to extract high purity plutonium. Japan should be able to monitor that, and it can also report to IAEA. Unfortunately, with Japan as a single nation, to ask for stopping the FBR to China would not be possible, but Japan should demonstrate the attitude that Japan is observing that, and this kind of attitude will be necessary. Thank you.
Currently, Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant in Ukraine, there are IAEA officials visiting there to confirm what is going on in the nuclear power plant. But there are some parts of the site where they cannot access because of Russian soldiers' presence. So inspection by IAEA cannot be performed. Safeguards cannot be applied to China's site, as it looks to increase plutonium production. So how can we clarify what should be done? Well, under the NPT, we cannot clearly say that China is in clear breach of NPT. But how would it impact China's nuclear armament? And it may possibly lead to further proliferation. I think we need to have China understand that and inform China to that effect. As Kobayashi-san said, in 2017, China stopped reporting its plutonium holdings to IAEA. And so plutonium holdings should be reported to IAEA by all the countries. That should be required, and that should be the first step to change the situation. In order for that to happen, I think we need to come up with specific actions, specific means. Just by calling upon China to report on its plutonium holdings will not work. We're running out of time, but from this point onward, well, what can Japan do? How can we inform China? So that's what I would like to ask the two gentlemen. As I said, so requiring countries to report on their plutonium holdings, for that to happen, how can we urge China to do so? If Kobayashi-san has a specific idea, under NPT since the late 1990s, there are discussions that are not going anywhere. One is the agreement on stopping the production of nuclear fissile material, and another is CTBT. And progress was expected, but it's stalled. And so if the two can see progress, I don't think we will be able to see any increase in the production of nuclear fissile material, but realistically speaking, we cannot expect that to happen. If that is the case, then we should increase nuclear transparency. So the risk of nuclear use should be reduced close to zero. Why not agree on that? I think Japan can propose that, realistically speaking. Given the reality, I think that is one of the things that Japan can do. So Japan, together with other countries, under NPT, Japan is proposing a standard form for reporting purposes. So the number of nuclear warheads, the number of delivery vehicles, quantitative information, location information can be included in the standard form, and we can exchange information through the standard form with each other. And based on that, we can negotiate nuclear disarmament, and it could be the first step. So I think that's one thing that we should start doing.
Earlier from Professor Takahara, you mentioned that to China, Japan's armament will be a nightmare. This is something they want to avoid. So let me confirm again, under the current NPT regime, a non-nuclear weapon state to have a plutonium to military use, this is am I correct to assume that this is going to be clear violation to NPT? Yes, and IAEA's stringent safeguard is respected after the World War II in Japan. So it is impossible to do that from Japan's perspective. Thank you very much. So in Japan, there is also a theory of possessing nuclear weapons. But as long as Japan supports the current NPT regime, possession of nuclear weapons will not be realistic. So now I would like to turn to Professor Takahara. So this kind of NPT regime, maybe not safeguard, but prior to that stage, the requiring a report on the plutonium holdings. And as was mentioned earlier, nuclear weapons to be increased rapidly, and from nuclear non-proliferation. This may be deviating from the direction that the world is expecting, and there will be more countries to that direction. And does China understand that? And also China, as Professor Takahara mentioned, they want to avoid that Japan would possess nuclear weapons. Of course, Japan may not possess nuclear weapons, but they want to avoid this kind of situation. And in China, not from a regulation perspective, but from a voluntary perspective, would it be possible to take action to China?
Under the Reagan administration, there was Mr. John Schultz, who was the Secretary of State. He passed away last year at age 100. And before he passed away, 1 or 2 years prior to his death, I heard his speech at Stanford University. So Mr. Schultz, Secretary Schultz, said was as follows. It was like his vote. So, nuclear war. We should never forget the horror of nuclear war. That was his message. There are only two groups of countries in the world. There are those who have nuclear weapons, those who do not have nuclear weapons. And of course, the latter is the vast majority. And if we can increase the number of non-nuclear countries, it would be good. And on the other hand, if we are to increase the number of nuclear powers, we will increase the chances of the planet's destruction. So Japan, we should continue to convey the message that nuclear war is horrible. And we need to understand the relevant parties to understand what the issues are. So vis-a-vis the nuclear powers and vis-a-vis the countries who are looking to acquire nuclear powers, we have to just continue to collaborate with them as we proceed. There's no other way. When China is met with strong opposition from large countries, they will be concerned, they won't support. And so, to the extent possible, we will try to bring as many countries as possible on our side, and that's the kind of diplomacy I think we need to have. I hope the Japanese government will conduct such a diplomacy.
Japan to collaborate with IAEA and under NPT regime. With the change of such regulation to prevent nuclear proliferation, and at the same time, to countries without nuclear weapons, we need to collaborate more to take actions to China. This is my understanding, and this kind of earnest effort would require more time, and the nuclear weapon expansion in China would not wait while we take such actions. Japan, at the same time, need to consider deterrence against China. Of course, although it is limited, Japan is now discussing to have some kind of retaliatory capability, but this is not a punitive kind of deterrence. This is not MAD, but we need to demonstrate that China's approach should not be successful. But if there is no U.S. extended deterrence, this will not also lead to China's deterrence. So U.S. extended deterrence should become more certain. That kind of effort should be made. These are not contradictory with each other. Once they are coupled with each other, then we should be able to deepen the discussion for nuclear deterrence. Today, we had an observation on China's expansion of nuclear capability, and how Japan should respond was also discussed for 1 hour. Thank you very much for joining the session. And with this, SPF China Observer observations on lack of transparency in China's nuclear arms expansion will be concluded. Thank you.
以上で笹川平和財団主催 SPF China
With this, we would like to conclude the public forum of observation on lack of transparency in China's nuclear arms expansion. Thank you very much for joining today.